Hey, I'm Matt, and this is Truth Snack, a channel that exists to help you discuss what really matters in life. And in this episode, we're discussing addiction. And so in a second, you're going to get to watch an online interview that I did with my buddy Pete, where we discussed addiction. And originally, this interview was done for a series I'm doing with my youth group, which is called Taboo, Things You're Not Supposed to Talk About in Church. So throughout the interview, there's going to be reference to my group and that series, but I thought the content was really great and worthwhile for pretty much everyone. So I thought I would share it with you guys. Enjoy the interview. Sunnyside students, Pastor Matt here. I'm here with a good old friend named Pete, who's making that face he makes when he feels awkward. I know.
Not
I know you well enough. Not awkward. What emotion are you feeling right now?
That's my sit back and that's my thinking face.
Oh, it's like I got something to say. Well, he's gonna be embarrassed, but I have to say that today we're talking to him. We're starting our brand new series, Taboo, Things You're Not Supposed to Talk About in Church. And the reason I'm talking to Pete, he doesn't want me to say this. Well, I mean, he may be a little shy, but he has a master's in Addictions Counselling, and we're talking about addictions today. And Pete, honestly, just knows way more about this than I do. So I thought if we were going to talk about this as a group, we should get Pete. Now, Pete lives like 10 hours away, so we couldn't get him here in person, but I thought we should at least talk about it. So Pete, that's kind of where you're at. Why don't you just get us rolling and help us understand what's an addiction? Because what I was thinking about this week is like, I was trying to define it for myself. And I was like, well, addiction is something you can't stop doing. It was like, but I can't stop sleeping.
Right.
Like I'm always going to have to sleep.
Right.
That's not an addiction. So help us as a group kind of sort out, just at the base level, what's an addiction?
Yeah, so an addiction is usually defined by something, some chemical or some behavior that actually has such a hold in your life that it becomes destructive. So it's something that, yeah, you can't stop doing, but it's not only something you can't stop doing. I can't stop drinking water. I can't stop holding my breath. Those things are making my life better. Those are actually keeping me healthy. Whereas if I can't stop, eating food, I never take a break and I never eat anything healthy and all I'm doing all day is eating. Eventually, at some point, that's going to go from helpful to harmful. And when we cross that line, it goes into something that is considered an addiction. When we're willing to put our well-being on hold in order to get the substance or perform the behavior, that's when we get into an addiction.
So you mentioned real quick the difference between like a chemical addiction or like a behavioral addiction. Why don't you just sort that out for me? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think when a lot of people think about addictions, they actually think about chemical addictions. We think about somebody on the street who's injecting drugs into their system every single day, or we think of somebody who's drinking.
That's themselves. Like the first thing we think about.
Exactly. It's like
horrible
where we go to when we talk about addiction is usually the worst case scenario. Usually it's heroin and alcohol and crack cocaine and all these terrible things that all of us recognize as being a harmful part of our lives. But behavioral addictions are generally things that are normal behavior. They're generally things that are commonplace to most of us that get a special grip in our lives, and it tends to be something that we use as a coping mechanism to get through hard times, or it can be from something that we develop sort of an unhealthy attachment to a behavior, whether that is gambling, whether that's an eating disorder, whether that's self-injury. We can become addicted to the behavior in a really, really intense way.
Okay, so why don't you just help it be really practical for all of us in the group? Like why don't you just start listing addictions? Yes, like some of the ones that maybe are less common, and then maybe go towards them like what's more common that we might even be experiencing.
Yeah, so some of the less common addictions tend to be the more severe and scary ones. The drug addiction, specifically, the street drugs, heroin. We're hearing a lot in the news about the opioid epidemic in Canada. That's painkillers. So painkiller addiction. Towards alcoholism, which touches a lot of families. Drug addiction, chemical addiction really has had huge impacts in Canadian households. Some of the more common addictions that I don't think people really wrestle with as much are things like addiction to internet porn, addiction to eating in some way, sort of an eating disorder, one way or the other, overeating or undereating. Self-injury is huge in Canada and the United States, where we see the cutting on the wrist, or we see embedding objects or bruising. Through gambling disorders, these are things that aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves. Playing poker is not a bad thing, but playing poker and losing your house is pretty problematic. So
Sure. And some of those we can definitely relate to, are more accessible for us. One thing you didn't mention, but I want to get your opinion because I hear about it online all the time, and is technology addiction. Like what is that? What's a technology addiction?
So technology addiction gets really tricky because in a world that we live in right now, it's almost impossible not to use technology.
Right, it's everywhere.
So we're
You
using
go
it
to
all the time.
McDonald's and you're ordering on a giant
Yeah,
fake cell
exactly.
phone to get your Big Mac. Yeah, got it.
Well, I think the average person with a smartphone is on it a minimum of 5 hours, 6 hours a day. And that's a massive percentage of our time. But when we get into technology addiction, there's a few different categories that fits into. One can be video game disorder, where the addiction actually has replaced real life. With video games, with video games, we're finding like this other world. We're involved in something that's not actually happening, but our brains don't know that. So when you're playing Call of Duty and you're right into it and you feel your heart rate increase and you feel sort of this intense bond with the game, it's because your brain doesn't actually know you're not fighting. Your brain sees that as an actual confrontation. And so if I do that every now and then, and that's something I enjoy doing, that's not a problem. But when I exchange the real world for the video game world, that tends to be when people cross into a part of their life that it's not productive anymore.
So yeah, so I'm curious for you to go there. Like, so things that might be, and I don't want to say like in our group, it's a place that we try to be accepting and welcoming for everyone, no matter where they're at. And so if someone is addicted to like a chemical drug, like of course they're welcome there. But some things that might be more common are like addiction to internet porn or technology addiction with our phone or whatever. So I'm really curious for you to help us see how might that practically influence our lives. Like, what are some signs of technology or internet porn addiction? Like, how are we going to see those take or manifest in our lives?
So an addiction usually is something you run to for comfort. Addictions are something that actually give us something. We get something out of them. I've heard certain people talk about we need to thank whatever our addiction is because potentially got us through some things. So when it gets to internet or social media or gaming or internet porn, it tends to be where we go when things kind of suck. So if we have a bad day at school, rough day at school, failed a math test, came home and got yelled at by mom and dad because we didn't do the dishes, where do you go? What do you go to for comfort, for mind numbing? Where do you go to get yourself through that bad day? Practically what this has looked like is isolating ourselves from people, right? Internet addiction is usually a very private addiction. It's something that happens by ourselves. It happens on laptops and cell phones. Usually internet addiction, specifically porn and social media, aren't things that are going to be happening in the public eye. They're things that are going to be us on our own. Where do we go when we are tired, when we are stressed, when we are overwhelmed? Because as human beings, we were created to go somewhere. That when we have days that overwhelm us, we were created with a gap, with a void that we need to go get filled somewhere. When I'm stressed, when I'm tired, when I'm scared, where do I go? Social media fills that void for a lot of people.
I mean, yeah, for sure. I think we can all feel a little convicted, like when I'm at home and I just feel like a little bored, maybe even just like feel down or lonely. I go on Instagram and I just check stuff out. So you're saying that's a way of trying to fill that void with technology, or so it's like in a sense exchanging relationships for these things. Is that a good way of saying it?
Yeah, I think so. I think because talking to people is awkward, right? I think admitting that I had a bad day, or admitting that I did something I shouldn't have, or admitting that I'm struggling with my emotions is difficult. Talking to somebody can be difficult. So if I can find somewhere to go that's private, that I think no one knows about, then I can do that in secret, not let anyone know I'm struggling, not really let anybody into the scary parts, but feel a little bit better at the end of the day.
Sure. Okay. So like how would that develop in someone's life? Like where does that, like we talked about filling a void, or maybe what I want to ask next is just like how do we approach this as believers? Like, so the group might not know, but Pete and I, like, we've known each other for a long time. We were in junior high together, we were in high school together, and like we went to youth group together, and we, if I can just be honest, for us as teenagers, we're vulnerable with each other about our addictions. So like from maybe more of a Christian worldview perspective, how do we tackle addictions in our lives?
We want to have our needs met. We want to be fulfilled. We want to feel comforted, and we want to feel like we fit in. As a Christian, we were created to have that need met in Jesus, that we were created to go to him. Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. In 1 John, cast all your cares on God, for he cares for you, right? We were created to, when we were at the low points, throw ourselves on Jesus. What happens is that we buy into the lie that the world's selling. We buy into the lie that the social media is selling, that more connectedness, having more likes on Instagram is really what would make you feel better, right? If that selfie you upload doesn't get at least 50 likes, man, that's going to be
like selfies.
That's
never
right.
Get 50 likes
that's
ever.
Right. No,
but I wish they did. I resonate with
I
that.
would feel good, right?
Yeah.
But buying into the lie that that's the ultimate solution. Pornography tends to be something that people go to for comfort. They go to for selfish release of their tension and their bad days, and it's just somewhere that they feel like they can escape and focus on themselves. So as a Christian, addiction is actually idolatry. It's putting someone else on the throne of my life, someone or something else.
Okay. We'll dive into that. No, dive into that, because I'm really curious. What do you mean by addiction is idolatry?
So we were created to worship. We were created to run to God when we had any need.
Right.
But as human beings, broken, messed up people, we've decided that we don't necessarily like what God has for us all the time, because it requires us to make some hard decisions in our lives. So we put other things in the place of God in our lives. If I have a bad day, what I run to tends to be what I worship most, where I find my belonging and my satisfaction. And so when I run to my computer and I am instantly onto Instagram to check the likes, if I'm going to bury myself into, if I consistently bury myself in 8 hours of Netflix a day to escape my real world, I've made Netflix my God functionally, the God that saves me from my bad days, the God that saves me from my scary emotions, and the God that actually I'm trusting to take care of me.
And you're saying, tell me if I'm right, ultimately doesn't really get the job done?
No,
Is that, like,
100%.
The addiction doesn't really help?
100% it does not get the job done. The lies that we have believed are everywhere. All of us believe, at some point have believed in these ridiculous lies that if I had more friends, I would feel fulfilled. If I were more popular, or if I was a better athlete, if I got better grades, if I had a girlfriend or a boyfriend, if I had more money, if I could fit in with this group of people, then I would finally feel fulfilled. And the things that we get addicted to basically have lied to us and said, all you need is me. Just a little bit more. The problem with addiction is we always chase that first high, whether it's a behavior or whether it's a chemical. The first time we do something and cross that line into addiction, it gives us this rush of feelings that we actually do for a little while feel satisfied. We do for a little while feel fulfilled. Then tomorrow when I go to that same thing, I don't quite feel the same. I don't quite feel as good. I don't quite feel as satisfied. But I still believe that this is what I needed to find my satisfaction in. So every time I go, I'm chasing what I felt that first day. And this goes for heroin and Big Macs and porn. It goes for everything, that we're chasing that first high and really trying to find the satisfaction that we initially felt the first time we trusted that behavior or that chemical to save us.
Sure. And I think, just tying it as a pastor into our group, I think it's like we all have idols. Like we've talked even about idolatry as a group. And so I guess my question is, like, when something is stigmatic like this, like there's a stigma, there's a negative thing, like you wouldn't want to tell people that you have an addiction. That could be really embarrassing. That could make you feel really crummy about yourself. But like what I want to ask you about is how do the statistics play out? Like I'm at this point in my life where I'm like, I don't want to be discouraging to anyone, but it seems like we'll probably all at some point in our life struggle with addiction of some sort. Like what do the statistics look like on that? Because you would know that so much better.
Well, the truth is that the time that we're in right now is probably one of the loneliest in human history. That every
Right.
every century before us lived in actual community with their neighbors. They had to survive, and we were created by God to live in that communion or that community.
Right.
What we've done now is we've created connectedness. We can be connected on social media, but never actually have a relationship. We have thousands and thousands of friends on Facebook, and
Right.
people we haven't talked to ever in our lives are following
Right.
us on Instagram, and we assume that means we're actually connected to them. But the truth is we don't have any of those relationships, and that loneliness and that lack of sharing actually creates a massive problem. Statistically, an addict who does not have a team behind them or is not part of a group of people that loves them and wants the best for them and will push them will probably not recover.
Right. Wow. That's shocking. Well, I mean, so again, to our group, Pete and I grew up same youth group, so he knows about hashtag intentional community and how important. Yeah, I'm embarrassed I did that. I'm embarrassed we just did that. but like, yeah. So I guess that's a good transition to like. So if and again, hopefully, Sunnyside Youth, they understand that if they're wrestling with addiction. The point of this series is to give you those opportunities to come out and say, just basically basing on what you just said, Pete, like. That you're going to be able to get through it so much better if you have a community that loves you. And I've wrestled with addiction, and many of our sponsors in their My Story nights have talked about addiction as well when they've shared kind of their story and journey towards Jesus. So basically the question is, how do we as an intentional community here at Sunnyside help each other? And not like turn the person who's struggling with addiction into like, you're a leper, like let's help you and fix you. But how do we really rally? Because I think the reality is that most of us are struggling with addiction of some kind. How do we do that best, Pete? Like what is it? What's a good path?
Well, for the people that are not struggling with addiction or not currently struggling with addiction, the first thing you can do is be patient and be willing to see past a behavior, right? A lot of times people with addictions, whether it's a behavior or a chemical addiction, feel like they get labeled as an addict. So if I come out and say I'm addicted to McDonald's, I'm going to be labeled as the fat guy who's addicted to McDonald's, right? And so, and I feel like I already feel the weight of that addiction and the weight of that realization that I'm in trouble.
Right.
It's really not helpful when I feel like the people that are around me are actually adding to that rather than giving space for me to just be more than an addict, more than someone who struggles, more than someone who eats too many Big Macs. So the first thing is the patience and the space for that. If you are not struggling, or if like you and your sponsors who are maybe through their battles or currently through your battles, creating the space for it to be okay that you're not okay.
Sure. So if someone is to share about their addiction, to go like, you do what? Or like, you're addicted to what is like the worst thing.
Absolutely.
You can do.
Well,
and it's helpful.
When we struggle, we already feel like that's the worst part about ourselves. None of us are pretending that that's the best thing about us. None of us are sitting here going, you know what, the greatest thing about me is my heroin addiction. We're saying, I'm comfortable enough with you, or I'm desperate enough to share with you that I'm struggling, I'm not okay. And so for then all of us to respond by going, ugh, is really not helpful.
Right, and like to almost even take that leper analogy even further, like Jesus interacted with people who were considered untouchable, like you reject them, and yet he was willing to touch them and have relationships with them.
Yeah, and I think also one more thing for people that are not currently struggling, if it's not your fight right now, be willing to do exactly that. I was just going to say, go out of your way to be actual friends, right? It's one thing to sit back quietly and listen while someone shares a hard truth in small group. It's something else to go up to them and say, hey, like, let's spend some time together. Let's get to know each other. Let's actually, let me walk with you through this, right? I think that's the crazy thing that you see with Jesus is that not only was, he could have stood on a hill and healed lepers from a distance. He could have.
Right.
He's Jesus. Yeah. But he actually entered in, and one of the most mind-blowing parts of I think it's in Luke, where he actually touches the leper.
Touches them.
And that's crazy, that because he could have stood back unclean and healed them from a safe distance, but he was willing to enter into their story intimately and get to physically touch someone who probably hadn't experienced touch in so long.
Right. Right. Okay. So what else can we do as a group that would help each other work through the things that we might be addicted to, whether it's technology or pornography or junk food or what?
Well, I think addiction brings a lot of shame. Way back from Genesis chapter 3, one of the first responses to sin is shame. Adam and Eve hid from God. They realized they were naked and they were ashamed.
Right.
That shame currently in addiction usually comes from the stigma, how other people treat us, but it also comes from the secrecy, the fact that it
Right.
is something no one else knows. Everyone thinks I have it together, but if they only knew this, maybe they
Right.
wouldn't maybe they wouldn't care about me so much. If you're struggling right now, my encouragement is to bring it into the light, right? I think
Right.
it's a theme all through the New Testament, right? Bringing darkness into light. The secrets we have only really have power as long as they stay secret. Once we bring
Right.
them into the light, into the right relationships, the right conversations, that will bring a sense of community and a sense of hope to us that, man, people know and they still don't hate me. They know this thing about
Right.
me and they're still here for
Right.
me. So I think having the courage to actually have the conversation about what you're struggling with is really the only way through.
Yeah, and that is terrifying. I'm sure people who probably feel tons of pressure right now knowing that reality. What I would want to say, and what I normally say to Sunnyside students in regards to their doubts, like intellectual doubts about whether Christianity is true, is that they should ask those questions of people that they know love them and that they trust. And so, when it comes to these addictions as well, it's the same kind of thing. You want to say, you want to tell these things to people that you really know love you and that you trust. So maybe a parent, maybe a close friend, but someone also that has maybe a little more wisdom than you, who's able to help you walk through it.
That's a good point. I would just
Yeah.
cut you off there.
Sure.
A lot of our friends, our peers, when we're in high school, just give terrible advice. And that's not any slap at anybody particularly, but the truth is
Right.
that oftentimes as a peer, as someone who's on the same level, it can be really hard to deliver the difficult truth. It can be really hard to deliver any sort of advice on a topic you're not very knowledgeable in. Too many people go through their lives Googling all the answers for tough questions, and Google gives terrible advice. So
Right.
we want to go to someone that actually can give us advice that will
Right.
bring us something better than what Facebook tells us.
So hey, so here's, I mean, you have a lot of advice. If I could, I know I could always turn to you. But what are some like resources or videos or something that, even as a group here at Sunnyside, something that we could latch onto if students are really wrestling with stuff?
Yep. So there's a Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. CCEF has a couple of incredible counselors who do some really awesome videos on self-injury, suicide, on anxiety and depression, on addictions, and they're on YouTube. There's a great option there to go and figure out what those guys have to say. And a lot of them aren't coming from. They're not coming from a position of only knowing a little bit. These are doctors and PhDs in psychology and have the real street credentials to be able to give us some good advice. There's a couple of books on eating disorders, on self-injury and suicide that I think are helpful. One is called Hope and Healing for Kids Who Cut, a behavioral addiction, and
Right.
and beyond that, I think Google can be a good thing as long as we're being eyes wide
Right.
open, right? If there's the
Right.
Kids Health Canada has a teen info section which gives really practical and local help for someone who is like desperately struggling. And if you're desperately struggling, that's the kind of help that you need, someone who can come
Right.
and give you the help right now. I would also, if we're getting brave and talking to people about this, I would go to probably the counselor at the school, at a high school or a middle school. They are
Right.
equipped to at least direct you in a direction that would get you help.
Yeah, and tell me, and I mean, I'm almost assuming that you didn't say this because it's almost obvious. It's like talking to your parents as well.
Yeah.
It's just like,
Yes.
it's like so, yeah, obvious. But I just want to say it as well. Like your parents, can be-
Parents,
Obviously love it a
grandparents, family members. I think people believe that, well, my parents would never understand this, you know.
Right.
I
And
think
that's
that's
definitely how it can feel.
it
for
can
sure.
feel that way, But in my experience counseling and working with through the generations, there's very few parents who haven't struggled, who haven't at some point faced scary, uncomfortable things, and I think are really desperate for their kids to feel comfortable sharing even the scary parts.
Right. And so it's like almost like in their heart, they really hope that you're going to open up to them.
Reach out.
Yeah. And I totally understand that. I mean, when I was a teenager, I didn't want to tell my parents about stuff for sure. But I think looking back, if I had, they would have been able to help me sooner with the things that I was struggling with. Okay. One last question, I guess, for you, Pete, which is just pretty generic. Like, so you're talking to my group and you don't really know them, but I know you well enough to know that you care about them and you want what's good for them. So just kind of, are there any last things unsaid? Is there anything that you would like to communicate them on the topic of addiction that we just haven't talked about yet? Like, what would you tell this group?
I think what I would say is that oftentimes people don't reach out for help because they don't believe that their problem is big enough or is worth the attention. There's a real issue where people are saying that they, well, look at this person and that person. How could I complain about my situation when these people have it so much worse? Sin will destroy you. Addictions will take over faster than you ever believed were possible. No one wakes up in the morning and decides they're going to be a crack addict today. It's something that tippy-toeing closer to the ledge, at a certain point, we're not going to have an opportunity to catch ourselves when the bottom falls out. I would say take this seriously. Take seriously the things that you can't control in your lives. You were created for discipline and self-control. You were created to be able to say yes to some things and no to some things. If there's something in your life that you are not able to control right now, be honest with yourself and be willing to have the awkward conversation to make sure that you're okay, because it's not something you want to bring into the rest of your life.
Right. It's like, don't underestimate what you might want to deal with now in your life rather than have it spiral out of control. Yep. Now, also, the students don't know this, but I want to reaffirm what you just said, because I know you have a train on your shoulder tattooed, and you love the saying, the train is freest on the tracks, which is essentially, that is kind of what addictions are about. It's like we limit ourselves. You could say, oh, the train is limited to just the track, but you're going, no, the track is where it's freest to be what it was made to be. And so addictions, it's like, oh, well, why can't I be free to just be online as much as I want or look at whatever I want online? But you know what? You're not going to actually live a free, vibrant life. John 10:10 style, Jesus came to give us life and life abundantly if we're actually like trapped in all these addictions.
100%.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Pete, for coming and hanging out with us. I really wish you could be here in person, but thanks to the miracles of technology. Yeah, maybe someday. Anyways, thanks a lot, Pete, and I really appreciate the time, and I'll see you later.
Sounds good. See you guys.